Hello and welcome to Tevora's webinar, California Privacy Rights Act, What Privacy Officers Need to Know. My name is Matt Fullerton, and I'm an account manager with Tevora. But today we will be hearing from Christina Whiting and Adorial Betheshu, the leaders of Tevora's privacy, enterprise risk, and compliance practice. If there are any questions, please use the chat function in GoToMeeting, and we will address those at the end of the presentation. But before we get started, just a little background. Here at Tevora, we're a management consultancy focused entirely on information security, compliance, and enterprise risk management. We offer just a huge range of services from security assessments and penetration tests to solution selection and implementation. Of course, we have a dedicated privacy practice for the various regional privacy regulations. That's Christina's team here at Tevora. We also support SOC 1 through 3, and we have a full healthcare practice providing HIPAA, HITRUST, and ISO services. Tevora is also certified by the PCI Council as both a qualified security assessor and as a PCI forensic investigator. We've been in business for nearly 18 years, privately owned with no outside investment or influence, and we work with companies of all sizes, all the way from startups to Fortune 500s. So that's just a little bit on who we are here at Tevora. Christina, Adorial, why don't you take it away?
Thank you so much, Matt, and welcome everyone. Happy to be doing this webinar with you just 2 days before Data Protection Day on Thursday, January 28th. So really what we want to cover today. Really the background of, what is CPRA, changes in its applicability from CCPA, what's new and what do we expect? Really, why does this matter to organizations when it doesn't become effective until January 1st, 2023? And where should organizations focus on first in order to create a prioritized list for action items over the next year to 2 years when it comes to implementing controls, programs, and processes in support of CPRA? And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Adorial to go over some of the background.
Thank you, Christina. So CPRA comes about as an amendment to CCPA, which was passed 2 years ago. The background to the amendment is that a lot of privacy advocate groups, particularly the main group that got CCPA passed, felt that CCPA fell short of full enforcement and what they would like to see out of a privacy law. So that's where a lot of the work came from. CCPA is proposed to be as a series of expansions to strengthen CCPA's oversight and to kind of like fill in the gaps where they felt that CCPA was falling short. And they also wanted to make sure that a lot of the loopholes companies were using have been filled. So Proposition 24 passes. That means that we are currently in the transition phase between CCPA and CPRA. The state is already hard at work on getting everything in place. So really it comes down to us and what we can do to make sure that we're doing our due diligence and getting ready for CPRA enforcement. And the overall theme of CPRA is expansion of business duties and more responsibility on the business. So going into scoping. So scoping changed a bit between CCPA and CPRA, determining what and who is in scope. The dollar threshold is the same. The main number difference is the differences in records. You see it started at 50,000. Now it's 100,000 records annual. In scope is one of the factors that will be determined for you to be in scope. It's also determined that the 50% or more of its annual revenue from sharing consumers' personal information, this has been expanded to include or sharing. The phrase or sharing is a recurring theme in CCPA and CPRA, and something to really keep in mind. Pretty much any activity that you previously were considering that involved the selling of data, now you have to include sharing of data is also in scope of CPRA. So that one word, those two words alone greatly increase the overall scope of the law.
Yeah, and that really directly affects a lot of really marketing campaigns, marketing firms, and organizations that have partnerships within it. So say you have a parent company and a large number of subsidiaries that are international. You're dealing business with California consumers. that sharing aspect is critical. And so practices and processes around not just selling, but sharing even internally within subsidiaries is a key differentiator in how internal practices need to potentially be adjusted overall with CPRA from CCPA.
Yep, exactly. And to Christina's point about marketing, CPRA does expand quite a bit when it comes to marketing. There's definitions for what advertising marketing is under the law, and there's also definitions of specific types of advertising, behavioral context advertising, whatever it might be, that are now defined under the law. So these are all things that marketing people need to watch out for. There's some considerations for children under CPRA. The enforcement of protection of children's data has been increased. Requirements of obtaining consent have been increased a bit. There's some new definitions and some new kind of requirements on what's needed. And there's also a new requirement on when you can seek consent again, and anything more than once a year could be considered a violation. They don't want any kind of soliciting of children in that case. You also need to consider that whether or not age is being considered at the time of collection, as the law now considers any willful disregard of age, or if you don't know the age, that now is defined as you knowing the age. So it's up to the companies to do the due diligence to make sure that anybody under 16 is accounted for. And that brings to the next point that while children aren't explicitly defined as being under 16, the enforcement is essentially the same for people under 16 as it is for people under 13. So the only difference is in some manners of consent collection, but when it comes to fines, when it comes to repercussions, and how often you can collect consent, companies need to consider that 16 is essentially a child under CPRA.
Yeah, and honestly, these two things, between the addition of sharing of consumer information, not just selling, and specifically the definition and the laws under CPRA for children, are two of the key critical factors of why Prop 24 was passed in the first place, and really have the biggest impacts to existing privacy programs that are in place to meet CCPA. You know, specifically taking this seriously, to add to what Adorial was saying, and I know we'll go into it in more detail in a little bit, but considering children under the age of 16, fines are tripled. So the state's being serious about what it means on the appropriate protection of children's data, and are specifically going to be looking at enforcement and procedures and protocols associated with making sure that organizations are accurately identifying its consumers and which category they fall under. Okay, so what's new? So that's a little bit about CPRA and the key differences with CCPA, but really let's go into a little bit more detail on some of the definitions and requirements that we really need to know about in a little bit more detail. For instance, some additional definitions. You know, what does risk and third-party requirements mean, even above and beyond CCPA? You know, what does law enforcement look like when it comes to any kind of central agency? And of course, you know, changes in consumer rights. I mean, that's what a lot of your customers are going to be asking about. That's going to be really that public-facing component of what do we need to worry about in regards to satisfying consumer rights.
All right, so for definitions, the goal is really to formalize and put on paper a lot of the key things left out of CCPA. There's a ton of definitions, a ton of new explanations on activities in CPRA. Some of the key things to point out, like we talked about earlier, advertising and marketing, there's a ton more restriction and consideration on these activities. So the main thing is there's this new restriction on combining data of people who've opted out versus those who haven't. So that kind of gets into companies need to be considering how they're managing consent, and if data is being pooled at all, if the consent is equal among all the subjects. There's now a formal definition of consent under the law, which was previously missing. So with that formal definition comes kind of the ability of the new California Enforcement Agency, which we'll talk about soon, to scrutinize a company's consent practices and say, oh, is this really what we want to see? One thing to be wary of is dark patterns, something that a lot of companies may not know that they do, but it's essentially any kind of activity in which acceptance of the terms of service comes about as through either not so much tricking, but even if it's buried in a long terms of service, that alone could be seen as you not doing your due diligence to make sure that the consumer knows what's going on with their data. And that gets to the next point, that CPRA now defines that any broad terms of use agreements that have privacy thrown in there, we see this a lot, that no longer cuts it. Now they want privacy to be its own agreement. They want data protection and all these rights to be called out separately. It can't be hidden in a large agreement anymore. So that's more consideration for policy-wise. And opt-outs. CCPA was pretty stringent on opt-outs alone, but that's been expanded a bit in CPRA. So there's now a further definition of it, and there's kind of scenarios on what they define to be an opt-out and what they don't define to be an opt-out. There's a bunch of options on how to execute opt-outs in the law, but really it's the key thing to consider is that there's now a requirement for a routine update of how opt-outs are collected. And that is all dependent on how the person is using the service. So that's something that needs to be annually checked on. Going to sensitive personal information, this is probably the most important definition to come out of CPRA. Previously, personal information was just its own category in CCPA. Now we have this other category of sensitive personal information, which has a bit more consideration as to what you can do with it. It has been defined, and it's a very long definition. It goes from Social Security to email content to race, finance, password. It's a lengthy list, but it's all there, which is a great reference in and of itself. The key thing to point out is the phrase necessary and proportionate. That's kind of like or sharing. That's like a recurring theme in CPRA. And that essentially means any use of the data, any collection of the data needs to be necessary and proportionate to the reason for the collection. And this is especially true for sensitive personal information. And going into that, some of the previous terms which were used to make up personal information in CCPA have now been further defined. So for example, geolocation is now defined to a specific radius in feet. So this is useful for marketing activities. This also means that the California agency in a privacy violation suit could argue about whether or not the geolocation was appropriate as far as advertising use. Profiling has now been defined as well, which kind of brings CPRA a step closer to GDPR. So profiling is now defined similar to GDPR as kind of being any activity which uses a person's data to create a profile of a person. And this is important in marketing. So any kind of automated decision-making based off of a person's data, any kind of automated processing activities, companies need to consider profiling. And de-identification, which was called out at a very high level in CCPA, is now formally defined, and they changed the requirements for what de-identifiable data is to kind of broaden it a bit. Before it was 4 or 5 bullet points that were to the point. Now it's 2 or 3 points that are broad. So there's more considerations for de-identification, and that really goes into making sure that data that we run through any kind of scripts or anything and to anonymize it, making sure that we really have de-identified it. And they do actually have call outs in the law about activities you can perform to make sure it's de-identified.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the automated decision-making as well. So the two kind of go hand in hand. So the pattern of, well, I use AI or I use machine learning, type scripts and language in order to perform a series of activities associated with our products and services in order to do X for our consumers. The item of saying, well, it's a black box is no longer acceptable. You need to be aware and fully acknowledge and understand how data is being used, even in those platforms. So understanding and working with the product designers and the engineers themselves on what the intent is, like how the ingestion process is working, the intent of the algorithms and the output, is vital, because that could be called to action and or additional descriptions if anything were to be challenged on your organization's practices overall. So clear and concise documentation, even down into that, artificial intelligence, machine learning kind of, embedded processes within the products and services is a key component these days.
Yep, absolutely. And with that said, going to security and integrity, which was previously defined in CCPA as at a very high level as just being secure organizational technical means, the common jargon that you hear. Now it's security integrity has been defined, and it actually takes a very heavy influence from incident response. That's kind of how they just define it, is the organization's ability to protect and defend against incidents. So that with that being said, the security and integrity in CPRA is first and foremost defined as the first monitoring and protecting personal information, which was kind of what it previously was. It was focused on personal information, but there is actually a second line in that same statement that asks organizations to be able to detect suspicious security activities and handle them and report them, and also physical security and the physical safety of your staff. So there is actually an argument that CPRA now has a overarching security call out, not just to privacy, but security of the organization as a whole.
Yeah, which is great, because it's taking more of a risk-based approach to privacy, which truly embeds that partnership between the need of security as a core component of privacy in order to facilitate that overall protection of consumer information. That's really, this is the first key step that we're seeing, under CPRA as an improvement to CCPA and closer to a GDPR type regulation that's tying the need of risk as the underlying core critical component in order to make decisions within an organization of how to collect, protect, and maintain sensitive personal information, but also really bridge that gap between security and privacy, showing that this isn't just compliance, this isn't just audit, this isn't just privacy, but this is a technical capability that needs to be built, monitored, and acted upon within the security and IT teams as well.
Yep, and keeping security in mind, there's actually a important provision of CPRA which makes risk assessments a annual requirement. Not only risk assessments, but privacy assessments on data activities, kind of similar to GDPR, of how a privacy impact assessment is required annually, and for any new activities that involve personal information, the similar considerations now need to be held up for CPRA. So that in mind, CPRA defines the security requirement to be tantamount to the data held. What that means is that the enforcement agency, in the event of a breach, could look at your security practices and tell you that this is inappropriate for what kind of personal information you hold. If there's excessive access or non-encrypted data, whatever it might be, data on sensitive information just on employee workstations, whatever it might be. These are all things to be considered now, as that could be argued to be non-equivalent to the data held. There is some subjectivity as to who is required to conduct the assessments, but for the time being, it's wise to assume that the agency and the enforcement body are going to be doing it for any large organization, anybody in scope that's processing personal information, as that is inherent risk to personal information. And the risk assessment portion is doubly true for projects involving outside parties, such as cloud hosters, processors. So you really need to make sure that your outside parties are included in these risk assessments, and that you're also collecting risk assessments from them. So, for example, getting a compliance report from AWS or from your data hosting provider annually is something that is expected now. By and large, we would say it's wise to use the GDPR model, because that's kind of the approach it's going. It's going into the annual audit phase eventually. That's definitely where they're going. So it's wise to use the GDPR model of the annual PIA, of the PIA for business activities, just to keep a step ahead of it. And the risk assessments, again, you probably do best by pairing them with the risk assessments your organization already does. Just key thing is make sure that privacy is not involved. That being said, there's also similar risk assessment considerations for third-party security. So main thing for third-party security, contractors are now in scope as third parties. Previously, it was kind of like the service provider lingo, the high level, but now there is a specific definition for what a contractor is and how you can share data with them and what their considerations are. By and large, it's the same as service providers. So if you have outside contractors, even one person, whoever it might be, and you're sharing your information with them, you need to exercise the same due diligence with them that you do with your other third parties. The third party's role and your service provider's roles in the data subject request process has been defined. So previously there was kind of one or two high-level sentences about throwing the request down the line to your third parties. Now there's a specific requirement for organizations to keep track of what data is going to what third parties, and that is necessary in order to make sure that when you get a subject request, you can send it down the line to the right third parties. Accountability has definitely been expanded as well. So contracts and responsibility, we're talking about contracts with your third party that establish security and privacy, that your organization needs to do the due diligence to make sure that your third parties are handling personal information in a manner that is appropriate to the data held. Ideally, it should be up to the same standards that your organization does. But the big thing is contracts and the necessity of businesses to establish accountability with their third parties. So even just having those contracts that say that you shall handle our data in such and such manner and store it in such and such manner goes a long way in holding up CPRA compliance. And again, necessary and proportionate comes up here too. So keyword for necessary and proportionate is the sharing of data with third parties necessary and proportionate? Are they storing it for a proportionate and necessary amount of time? These are all things that can be solved with contracts and annual security reviews, but just keep in mind that eventually we're seeing it now in CPRA. We're going to see the trend going even more for third parties, that there really is a requirement for businesses to make sure that they're handling data appropriately. And joint ventures are defined, which kind of brings us a bit closer to GDPR. So we've actually seen a couple of, at Tevora, a couple of joint venture clients, and there was questions about how you handle data going between them. Big thing to know is that besides data being shared explicitly for the joint venture, the companies need to remain separate. So with that in mind, there is other considerations as to what joint ventures are allowed to do. How does a joint venture respond to a data subject request? How does a joint venture respond to a breach? So there is considerations for joint ventureships now. Law enforcement. So going into law enforcement, largely the consideration is that CPRA now puts a big role on businesses in the law enforcement process to comply, to essentially comply with a huge exemption of data subject requests. So a data subject request that comes into your organization from a person that might be under investigation for whatever reason, law enforcement could, without a warrant, without a subpoena, without anything, just on probable cause, request that the person's data be withdrawn and held. So in that case, you need to make sure that you're abiding by them and that the person's data is pulled from production, but that it's held somewhere. And really, that the best way to implement this is in some sort of policy, just to make sure that maybe in incident response scenarios that people know what to do when law enforcement comes knocking.
Yeah, I would say that's really close to like legal holds, as legal holds are treated, nowadays at most organizations. And so we would almost equate this to a legal hold process. The key difference being, as Adorial mentioned, not having to have a subpoena necessarily or a warrant in order to request the holding of certain data. It's important for internal organizations to identify what that protocol and procedure will be in order to accept and process those requests. Like, for instance, you need an email, any other formal kind of letter. in order to document that this was truly an authorized entity requesting that data be separated and held for a period of time in support of something, since formal legal paperwork like warrants or subpoenas are not necessarily required. So it's important to work with your internal legal teams in order to identify and say, what is the acceptable request process that we're going to go through and hold it, and then maybe integrate it into your legal hold process, since it is very similar type, and work from that perspective, and then have key ties into, as Adoria was mentioning, your incident response program overall.
Yep, absolutely. And keep in mind that these are all 90-day windows. So a request comes in from law enforcement, 90 days data has to be held, and that can be renewed by law enforcement until it's reasonably deemed by them that there's no reason to hold it any longer. And there is also an extra provision for emergency access to data. So if law enforcement deems that a person's safety or life is at risk, they can request emergency access to data without a warrant. So these are all things that it's best to have in policy, just to be able to respond appropriately when the time comes. So new rights. So CPRA expands on a lot of rights, protects and protections, and kind of defines a little further the requirements for handling these rights, what's applicable, how do you respond. So the right to correction has now been formally defined as a consumer right. There was reference to it in CCPA, but now it's it's stronger, it's more GDPR-like is the best way to say it. So the requirement on businesses is to take whatever means commercially available, meaning at the expense of businesses, to correct the information of a person. And it's also very important that this right be advertised along other rights. And that kind of goes into another statement in CPRA, that it's up to the businesses to make sure that the consumer knows about their rights. So however you can get the message to them in the terms of service, in your privacy notice, in white papers, whatever it might be, businesses do need to do a bit of due diligence in making sure that their subjects know their rights. The right to limit use and disclosure of sensitive personal information. So kind of going back to sensitive personal information and how it's been defined, and it's received expanded protection. So consumers have the right to request their information be limited, potentially to the point of the absolute bare minimum. But the only pushback there for businesses is, of course, the usual law enforcement ones, and whatever data is, again, necessary and proportionate to the service. Any use of sensitive personal information now requires new notice. So previously, it would have been in your privacy notice or wherever it might be that you're collecting this information, this is the purpose. Now it requires notification of the data subject. So that's a key thing to keep in mind for any businesses that are handling large amounts of sensitive personal information, like healthcare, payment organizations, whatever it might be. And again, going back to service providers and their role with the request, so they need to comply. There's instructions on what they need to do, and it's also up to third parties and really the business to use their best judgment to determine if something is sensitive personal information. Again, going to this point and then to CPRA as a whole, a lot of the language has been broadened such that the responsibilities on the business to do their due diligence. So when it comes to sensitive personal information, the enforcement agency might ask, well, why didn't you consider this piece of data sensitive information prior to the breach? And marketing, going back to the opt-outs, there is a specific opt-out now for the share and use of sensitive information for marketing activities. Prior, it was just opting out of sales of personal information. Now it's opting out of the use and share of marketing, and this can be done at any time. So these are all considerations, mainly for marketing, that need to be put into policy. And the requirement, going back to the requirements that we talked about, so there is a lengthy section on what specifically you need to be doing as far as the requirements for these DSRs. So There is a time frame, 45 days for deletion and correction requests. That's previously, I believe, it was without undue delay, but now 45 days is the time frame within the receiving. But pro-business, now CPRA establishes the business's right to request authentication, and it kind of recommends it, and of course it's best practice. But there is also, going to the verification, there is a specific call out to what you do with the additional authentication data you get. So a lot of times we've had clients, for example, that might collect like a driver's license to authenticate somebody for a DSR. In that case, that driver's license needs to be completely segmented from your whole environment, whole business, and after the DSR, that data needs to go. So those are all extra considerations there. The disclosure window for how much data is to be disclosed has also been defined. So now it's been defined as a 12-month minimum, but consumers can request longer if they need to. So keep in mind for retention limits, if you have anything, make sure that you're keeping 12 months minimum of personal information, because a request from CPRA might request 12 months. And there is also just extra consideration for how you provide it. I believe there was already something similar to this in CCPA, but it's just called out greater that it needs to be in a clear, readable format. Electronic means is okay. You can actually do electronic only if your business is electronic only. Paper means is okay. But the idea is that the format you give the person, the format that you give to the person is common enough that they could take it to another business if they need to. So again, that kind of hints that we might be going towards a trend of data portability like GDPR has.
Yep, absolutely. And we understand that data subject request is a huge topic to be discussed, and that has to be planned for, and has one of the biggest implications when it comes to creating, or I should say, the operational process of a privacy program. And so understanding and knowing this, I mean, this could be a topic in and of itself. Look for our website in the next week, because we are going to be releasing a detailed comparison chart between CCPA and CPRA, and along with actually GDPR. That's going to show a lot of these key differences that organizations need to start mapping out and planning for. That is above and beyond the existing programs that you've created under CCPA. All right, so really kind of moving into why should we be paying attention right now. As mentioned, CPRA doesn't become enforceable until January 1st of 2023. That's almost 2 years away. But there's a lot of considerations that have to be factored into above and beyond CCPA, and even differentiators between GDPR that most organizations are complying with right now. And so one is that new data retention limitation. Another one is changes to breach liability to organizations and how you act on it. And really that new enforcement agency and fines, like what should we be planning for, what should we be prepared for. Under CPRA and California legislature, they try to take into perspective the lessons learned from GDPR when it comes to the formal establishment of a centralized body, how quickly you can establish that, what kind of auditing rights you have, and they're really trying to build upon that overall. And so kind of jumping right into new data retention limits.
Yep, and here's another two-word definition that changes a lot for CCPA, but or retain has been added to most instructions on data usage. So retention is now defined as a activity, essentially. So with that being said, companies need to make sure that the provisions in place for collecting and sharing data, especially when it comes to consent, that also needs to be applied to the retention of data. So that's a bit of expansion when it comes to data governance on the retention phase. And again, it's entirely based on the legitimate necessity. So full disclosure. So data minimization hasn't been defined fully yet. I think that's one of the things that critics of Prop 24 were talking about, but I feel that that's a trend we're going in. It's essentially been defined, but not the phrase minimization, but data retention is of course now required to be necessary and proportionate, and now needs to go. Data needs to go after a service is complete. So this essentially is data minimization, but it kind of gets into the question of how are we how are we looking at the data lifecycle when it comes to our organization? Are we identifying the time frame we need it when it first comes in, or whatever it might be? And going to the disclosure of all this, companies actually have to now are required to disclose the length of time they plan on collecting and or retaining the data. This is potentially difficult, so that's kind of where we get to time frame versus criteria. If you can't provide the time frame of how long you're going to be holding it, then you need to provide the criteria for how long you would you assume to be, or how long you would guess to be holding it. For example, if you have it for a year, then you say a year. If you have it until the service is done, then that's enough to get go an estimate. And again, going to the so for the verification issue, that kind of goes back to what we were talking about, verification for DSRs. That's actually been a huge question that we get from clients all the time about if I'm collecting new data for a data subject request, that's like a catch-22 kind of, but this has been patched a bit with CPRA. So again, going back to it, now there's a requirement for data collected for DSR process, how long you can hold it, what you can do with it, and then when it needs to go. Perfect. So breach liability and fines. So there's a few considerations for liability. Main thing is that the enforcement body now expects proactive, not reactive remediation. And they actually determined specifically that if a business implements the appropriate security measures after a breach, then that no longer constitutes a quote unquote cure to the breach. So the security for sure needs to be proactive, and reactive security might not even be a remedy to avoid a fine. The big thing for breach liability is the expansion of scope, and prior it was only non-encrypted and redacted info, but now emails and access information is included. What this means is that not only is encrypted or non-encrypted data in scope of breach liability, but so is encrypted data if it was accessed through some other means. So this is very important, of course, because this gets into the question of access management, identity management, least privilege, and segmentation of duties, because a person that gets access to your organization through any gets access to an organization through stolen credentials essentially has breached your organization.
Yeah, and if we look at the fines themselves, you'll notice here, as we were talking about before, minors and anybody under the age of 16, the fine is $7,500. It's just triple that of a violation. That's $2,500, as previously mentioned. Per record fine, Adoro, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's $750 per record. Yes, or per consumer. Yeah, per consumer. And so that's pretty significant. I mean, the trends aren't out there yet of what is the overall cost of a privacy violation, and I'll call it a violation versus just a breach, because it doesn't necessarily have to be a breach in traditional security terms. But even if those numbers aren't out there yet, what we can see is the average cost of a security breach is around $200 per record, give or take, depending upon what trend or analytics or what year you're pulling data from. Well, that's $200. And that bakes in supposedly your notification process, your legal fees, your technology updates that you need to make, internal process changes, what have you. Right here, we're just talking about $750 per record, and that's not including your legal fees that you have to pay for, any kind of technology, internal process change or whatever.
Everything else.
So you can quickly see how significant this impact could be on an organization when it comes to fines and the severity really that the agency is taking in regards to the privacy of its consumer information within California itself. And so we're almost quadrupling the cost, and this is just the fine. This has nothing to do with any of the remediation status in order to correct what happened originally. So this is definitely something to pay attention for. I fully expect, but we're still not going to have numbers for another year or two, but some numbers will start to trickle out. The cost of a privacy violation will be significantly higher than the cost of traditional security violation and breach fines.
Perfect. So we've made reference this whole time to them, but here's the new California enforcement agency, dubbed the California Privacy Protection Agency, so CPPA.
We don't have enough acronyms.
Yeah, I kept messing that up too. I was kept going CCPA. But yeah, the CPPA is the new governing body which will enforce the law. Prior, it was up to the Attorney General and people and the state to bring forth cases. Now there is going to be a official agency appointed by the governor, the Assembly, and the Senate. And there is a specific requirement for the members of the board to all have expertise in the areas of security and privacy, and they define that as well. So you could expect the enforcement agency to know it a little bit better than the Attorney General, just in short terms. They will go through enforcing the law, and they also have a requirement to promote public awareness of privacy and security. So the idea is not only enforcement, but also making sure everybody knows their rights. So with that being said, you could potentially expect to see increases in consumer rights or consumer right requests coming in once the agency is pushing through their marketing activities. And there is also a requirement for the agency to actively monitor new technology, which is, I think, pretty good for a technology law, but it's up to the enforcement agency to look at new trends in data collection and technology, whatever it might be, and amend the law as necessary. So what this tells us is that CCPA, CPRA, and privacy as a whole is going to be like a living, breathing document that changes as technology changes. And they do also reserve several 10, 15 or so rights to enforce new regulations. So the enforcement agency has quite a bit of oversight. And the main role that we want to talk about is the CPA, the Chief Privacy Auditor. Going back to what we were talking about with the risk assessments, the CPA has been formally established as the person who will receive annual security and privacy audits and ensure compliance. So there is now going to be one individual or one body, one office that is handling privacy audits for essentially the state.
Awesome. So when it comes to a prioritized approach of, what we should focus on, prior to an enforcement date in 2023, there's a series of things that need to occur, most on an annual basis, if not as part of underlying components that need to be built. One being when we look at annual, it's that, privacy impact assessment, it's that third-party security due diligence, it's the audits and assessments against the organization overall, and it's policy revisions. All of those are definitely minimum requirements for an annual basis, and data governance being that foundational component in order to build, improve, and monitor upon your entire privacy program, because without data governance, it's difficult to say and understand truly the transparency around the data lifecycle and movement and sharing of data with third parties and subsidiaries or any other organization when it comes to either just selling or sharing overall. And we'll run through this pretty quickly so we can open it up for any kind of questions. And mainly these are the questions as Adorial goes through it a little bit. These are the questions of what you should be asking yourselves as you go through each one of these annual commit requirements.
Yep, absolutely. And we prioritize them in order of what's the best order according to us. PIA is definitely the first step for any privacy program. You can't do anything unless you know where you are already. So the PIA is kind of like your enterprise risk assessment. It's a legal requirement now. It's been a requirement under GDPR. So again, looking at your organization, saying where do we stand? What kind of privacy practices do we have? Does it have the correct oversight? Does it have the correct tools? Are we doing enough? So some organizations might be doing more than enough, actually. We come across sometimes. Some might be doing not enough. That all gets down into prioritization. Privacy kind of loses a bit of prioritization overall when it's handled by security legal teams. Those extra channels and that extra kind of bit of research required to understand the laws makes it a little bit more difficult. So you definitely want to use your PIA to look through your business processes and your security and your organization and just see, are we complying overall? And the best part is that it tells you what you need to do next.
Yeah, and this also reinforces what is your scope, so you can validate scope of what you're applying the privacy law against is still accurate. Oftentimes we see that the privacy impact assessment might be performed at the same time as your privacy risk assessment, because it does go into that both business and technical process overall, so you can combine the two efforts together. Or as Adorial mentioned previously, you can combine the privacy risk assessment with the security risk assessment. You would just have to expand your scope to additional individuals and roles throughout the organization in order to cover additional business processes overall.
Yep. So big thing for aligning your organization is align it on paper. That's for third parties, for everything we talked about. Aligning it on paper is the best first step that you can do, mainly to establish accountability and responsibility. So going into policy is the big question everybody asks themselves in security and compliance is, can we unify compliance? And actually, it might be easier with CPRA since the definitions and everything are a little tighter and more bolted down compared to CCPA. That also gets into the point of where does it intersect with GDPR, since GDPR is kind of what every privacy law aims to be, essentially. There is more intersect between the two now, and for organizations that are already well established when it comes to GDPR, this is actually an opportunity to take those practices and apply them even more so across your organization through to California. Because again, California is a trend, so we do see this going to other states. We do see similar provisions going on, so it's good to get ahead of everything. And then again, considering what applies for CPRA, what applies to you, and taking those components, applying them into your policies. How are we going to do it? That gets into the process side, and that gets into the auditable side. So having it in your policy is okay, but also taking it and building out a procedure, a control, whatever it might be, just something that you can show to an investigator, an auditor, whoever it might be, and say, look, when it comes to privacy, we do this, and we do this, and we use these tools, and so on. So there is a lot of power in just putting your program on paper.
Yeah, and this is that privacy governance aspect of, what's performed and what can be audited to in the organization, what can be called upon from a repeatable process. This is where this oversight and governance comes into perspective on the policy side.
So data governance. So you can't really have privacy if you don't know your data. That's the first step, absolutely, for implementing everything is knowing what is where. Data governance, you want to first start off with any kind of inventorying activity. So if your organization hasn't already, putting it on paper with an activity where you go through and you determine these databases have this data, employees have this data. You can do it manually. You can do surveys, questionnaires. We've seen several methods that work for organizations. There is also the automated route, which would make it a ton easier and a ton more accurate. So once you have that in place, you understand what you have, then you can get into applying CPRA's retention requirements, making sure that minimization is in place, making sure that there's rules around data and automatic purging, and ownership. Assigning ownership, while there isn't really a call out to assign ownership in the law, it's also kind of just tantamount to actually ensuring data governance is having that ownership. And stragglers. This is a huge thing that we see for clients, especially clients that are early in their privacy phase, early phases of their privacy maturity. There's always data stragglers on employee workstations, on this or that. Companies might think that they only collect such and such data, but then we'll find that they have PCI information or whatever it might be on employee workstations. So that kind of goes back into the automation, actually, that you can really tackle the stragglers better with automated means, but you can also find it through manual means. Perfect. So we talked about third-party security. Again, there's the question is responsibility. The responsibility of you as a business to make sure that your third parties are compliant. So the questions to ask yourselves: do we have a comprehensive view into how we share data, or is it just being shared ad hoc? Is there anything around it? Is it monitored anywhere? Do we know how often we do it? Especially the knowing how often you do it is important for handling data subject requests. So that kind of gets into the point of like third-party dashboards and like visualizations of how data is shared with third parties. Asking yourselves, are we collecting the right consent to share data? Keep in mind that there is new considerations for sharing and for sharing sensitive personal information. Have we considered classification? So there's, of course, the new sensitive information requirement. There is also the requirement for businesses to do their due diligence and make sure they're classifying well. And classification is particularly important for data going to a third party if you're to ensure that they're implementing the appropriate security measures. And do we have the right contracts in place? So GDPR, for example, requires data processing agreements. Something like that alone could take away most of the privacy burden, but it really does just get into the question about asking, are we establishing security requirements with these with our parties? Are we establishing privacy compliance? Have we worked at all as far as how we're going to receive a third party from them? So these are all important questions to ask. And the due diligence just gets back into the overall security of the whole program of handling third parties. And for audit and risk assessments, this is actually kind of mostly a good and easier takeaway from CPRA because most organizations do security risk assessment as part of some compliance already or as a best practice. Key thing is, are we including privacy? So how do you include privacy? We would definitely recommend that's where frameworks are super helpful. And this privacy framework is excellent for describing how you include privacy in your risk assessment process and what a privacy risk is versus a security risk. But this is where we get into asking what extra considerations are there now? How do we conduct a privacy risk assessment? How do we focus on a risk to personal information versus a risk to the business? There is opportunity for the merge of a PIA and a risk assessment to be conducted simultaneously, but we also wouldn't recommend fully combining them because they do kind of look at different things overall.
Yeah, and the key here is when you go to any kind of privacy risk analysis or audit process, we understand that there could be two different scopes and focus, one on the technical side, one on like the business and the data portability and data governance side. And so when you're looking at technical considerations and embedding it within security and IT, it's important to look at those detailed privacy risk scenarios. And a good resource would be the OAuth top 10 privacy risks identified year over year, because it'll go into the technical consideration of the security controls that should be implemented as part of a privacy program in order to prevent risks. Cool. Some of the trends that we're seeing in privacy, taking this all into perspective, it's a lot of it is around making sure your consumers are educated and aware and truly know what your privacy practices are. So with CPRA, we're going to see more of a trend around using this as a branding tool, aligning a lot of the marketing language and branding language within the privacies themselves and simplifying it overall. And so it's really around not only streamlining your external facing privacy policies with maybe a sub-link to the more legalese version of it, because you really want to describe in a couple of paragraphs what you're doing, what your mission is, what your objectives are in regards to privacy, but still keep your legal requirements upheld within it and simplifying it. But it's also around internal employees too. It's simplifying your internal privacy policies where employees know what they can and cannot do from that privacy governance perspective in regards to policies, data governance standpoint in regards to how data can be leveraged and used throughout the organization and sharing, and really looking at overall specific marketing campaigns. I think we're going to see a lot of organizations start to use privacy-aware consumers and culture as part of marketing campaigns. So terminology and processes and simplification is definitely going to be a trend in 2021 as organizations start to revamp their policies and practices. All right, so timeline, just really quick. As we start to approach that January 1, 2023 deadline for enforcement of CPRA, CCPA is still enforceable by the Attorney General. It doesn't go away. It's not put on hold or anything like that. It's still in effect. And so key dates along the way, to make sure that you don't wait until that January 1st, 2023 deadline, is data applicability. So that, reverse engineering data, it might be applied January 1, your data applicability starts January 2022. So that's less than a year away of when practices all need to be in place, so that way when January 1, 2023 comes in, that year back lens and look can be upheld to your consumers. And then just really the adoption of regulations and everything like that overall. All right, so question and answers. I know we're really about to finish here in 2 minutes. We've been monitoring the chat window throughout this entire session over the last hour. And so we've been kind of filling in those spots and answering those questions along the way that people have been posing. So I don't believe there's any extra ones that are open right now. That's why we've been trying to fill it in with some additional dialogue as we go through. But if you do have additional questions or anything like that, I'll show a slide here in a minute with Adorial and mine direct email addresses where you can feel free and reach out to us or reach out to any Tevora contact that you have, and we're more than happy to answer any questions that come up. In the meantime, I wanted to say a couple of things that are upcoming content-wise. So we have a privacy newsletter being released this week. We have a privacy tracker that I'll show a screenshot of in a minute that we're releasing this week. We have a couple additional blog posts that are being released within the next 2 weeks, really all in support of this Data Protection Day, to make sure that we're getting as much information out there to organizations in order to make informed decisions. I did have a follow us on social media set of links on here so that you can see when we release them, but apparently it disappeared somewhere. But you can follow us on social media because we'll announce when things get released, whether it be LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, anywhere else, and also our website when we release these things. The one big thing that we do want to announce is we will be releasing this week an online privacy tracker that literally lists out all the major international laws and state laws associated with privacy, and compares and contrasts them overall, so you can select which ones you want to see, scroll through it, and then you can also download the Excel spreadsheet overall. So stay tuned for that. We will be sending out an email and having announcements of when that public link will be available for you to go ahead and leverage. But it has something like 70 or 80 different areas in order to compare and contrast against. And again, there will be a downloadable spreadsheet format for you to access to as an additional resource. So that'll be released. So with that, we definitely appreciate everyone's time today. And again, please feel free and email us, reach out if there's anything you need whatsoever. If you have additional questions or in regards to the content we were just sharing today, or just questions in general about privacy, more than happy to go ahead and answer them for you. So thank you everybody for attending. Hope you got something out of the session today, and have a good one.
Thank you, everyone.